everyone. Thank you so much for the opportunity to be here today. This is a really great initiative, so very pleased to be contributing to. So Dr. Cheklam really started with this incredible presentation this morning, very technical, and I commend you because we work a lot with a lot of technical researchers, and normally it's very difficult to convert very complex topics in plain, easy to understand language. So I'm going to be building a little bit on that, which is helpful. My presentation is going to be a lot less technical, a lot broader. As it was mentioned, my background really is more in law and policy. And a lot of my conversation and what I'll be covering is based on the recent research that we have conducted, which is quite broad, covers a lot of different issues, as I will walk you through. Okay, so some background about the AI Asia Pacific Institute, if you don't know. So I am the executive director of the institute, and we very much cover research. So if you look at our board of directors, advisory board, affiliates, the intention behind our work was to bring an interdisciplinary approach. So how do we tackle some of the implications of AI, whether they're positive or negative, by looking from different lenses, right? So you not only have technologists talking about technology, but you're bringing different perspectives into the conversation as well. We also do a lot of policy activities, and so a lot of our research-based work really feeds our policy activities, as well as our awareness-raising work, which builds on workshops, presentations, and a lot of education work that we do. And we engage a lot with international organizations as well, such as the United Nations, ASEAN, because from the perspective that AI is a very cross-border issue, right? And how do we think about how different countries can cooperate on such complex issues, and thinking about how do we foster really the technology to support us into a better world, working together towards that. So some of our recent work that we did, which is going to be very much feeding into what I'm going to be presenting today here. The first was, as Dr. Cheklam walked us through today, a year or two ago, we really saw this rise and the breakthrough of generative AI with the introduction of ChatGPT, right? And I think that what they did is that suddenly AI became something very tangible that people can relate to, right? It's not that it's necessarily new. AI has been around for a very long time, as we saw in the chronology that he showed us this morning, right? But what that did is that it made it very real for us. We can now talk and see, I think, the impact and the potential of the technology, right? So right when that happened, ASEAN, for example, had done a lot of work thinking about traditional AI, right? So they really looked at, this can bring us a lot of benefits. There's a lot of risks involved as well. So how do we deal with these new issues? And so they had the guide on AI, which looked quite carefully at traditional AI and how the regional countries could come together there. And then you have generative AI, which really introduced new potential benefits, but also potential risks, right? And so we were engaged to produce a discussion paper that looked quite carefully at generative AI, its potential for the region, as well as its risks. So as part of that, we made some recommendations and carefully thought about some issues, like there was a great question this morning here about how do we adopt AI in the local context, culturally, respecting local values, right? And that is a challenge for the region. So we consider a lot of those issues as we work towards that. We also recently worked very carefully on the intersection of AI and online safety, right? We know there's a lot of risks that have been introduced to us with the rise of the internet, and now in some ways they have been exacerbated with the introduction of AI. And so I'll walk us through some of the insights from that work as well, which was done in collaboration with an organization called NetSafe under the New Zealand government. And then finally, we have an upcoming study, which I'm going to be talking a little bit about. It hasn't been published yet. It will be published in a couple of weeks. That is a collaboration with LinkedIn. And we looked at a few countries in Southeast Asia. What is happening around the workforce transformation? So we know AI is very much changing the job landscape. I think we can all agree to that. It's augmenting certain jobs, but it's also automating and taking away other jobs. So we looked at the state of that in some specific countries, and no one better than LinkedIn to provide data, really carefully looking into that. So I'll also cover that. So you can see it's a lot broader. We're going to walk through some of the high-level benefits of generative AI. We're also going to talk a little bit about the risks, particularly around cybersecurity. We saw a little bit about deepfakes as well before. I'm going to dive a little bit more on that. And then we're going to go to talk a lot about capacity building, right, based on that work with LinkedIn. And then hopefully I can leave you with some insights into what it means to think about how do we adopt and develop AI in a responsible way, what it means to do that here in the region, in our context, right? And then hopefully leave some time for questions at the end. So why AI matters for ASEAN now, right? So we know AI has been around for a long time. There's a lot of history now. When we think about that transformation and how it's taking place now in the region, we can really see, for example, we have 60% of the population in ASEAN, it's under the age of 35. That's appearing quite small there, sorry about that. So we have a very young generation in the region. And that is both an opportunity, but also a risk, right? It's an opportunity because you have very young people who are very technologically up to date in some way, so they're very comfortable to be upskilled. They are probably growing up with AI already. They understand some of the background, the potential that it has. On the other hand, our education systems and many of the ways or foundations that we currently have are not necessarily aligned with the jobs that might exist in 10, 20, 30 years from now. We're not entirely even sure what they're going to look like, right? And so how do we ensure that right now we are preparing that workforce in a way that they can very much step in and tap into the potential of the technology, right? We have about 57% of job transformation in the region. So we know for sure that at least 57% of jobs are going to be changed by AI. And that is a lot, right? And we're not entirely, I guess, sure what exactly that looks like yet. We are all navigating in many ways. We also have between 25 to 30% of, I guess, what is the biggest issue for the region, which is something called the digital divide, right? We still have about 25 to 30% of the region which does not have access to the internet, for example, to really tap into AI. For AI to really foster, we need a lot of infrastructure in place and access. And the challenge that we have is that if AI is only in the hands of a few, we're not equally distributing the access and the potential of the technology to everyone there, right? So essentially, this brings us to a moment in time where we have a lot of opportunity for the region, and also a lot of challenges, right? Because there's a large transition that is happening right now. We have seen this before. In some ways, we are in what's called the fourth industrial revolution, right? And there are some lessons that we can learn from the previous industrial revolutions. However, AI is also something entirely new because in many ways it's creating intelligence, creating knowledge, as it's been said this morning, right? Like we haven't seen before. And the impact that that will have on humanity and jobs, it's essentially will be a lot more, I think, encompassing than anything we have seen before. We know, I guess, the benefits of AI in general, right? But as part of this work we did engaging ASEAN, we carefully looked at what are the specifics about generative AI that create a new opportunity for us, right? And the first one really is accessibility. We have seen accessibility, the possibilities of essentially putting the technology into everyone's hands, becoming very possible with the rise of the internet, right? And then we saw that scaling to having more of the traditional AI systems coming and people that were able to understand and learn about those technologies, they were very quick to be able to use it. Think about what are the applications that this would potentially serve as the most benefit, right? We know that with that, again, to tap on the accessibility, it's important that we have the foundations for access, right? One of them being simple access to the internet, right? We still have, in the world, about 2 billion people that don't have access to the internet, right? So we're in this room here speaking about AI, fully aware that I think there has been a lot of statements about how AI will augment everyone, and that is partially true. It's also not true to say that on a global level. And I think when we look at the current inequalities, right? In terms of benefits, again, I think developing and consolidating infrastructure, right? I think we're really seeing that in the education space in terms of how things used to be done before, access to research, in terms of speed and analyzing. That has been, I think, new levels of efficiency in terms of being able to engage with AI that way. And then finally, I think, consolidating research and development, right? So these are general, some of the specific benefits that you have with generative AI there. And with those benefits, of course, as we talked about, then you also have the introduction of new risks, right? And that's where we carefully looked at when we work with NetSafe. We looked at those existing risks that were introduced to us in the age of the internet, what is happening to them. Some of the things we talked about, deepfakes, misinformation, what is actually happening there, and how do we fix it, right? And I think that a lot of those issues that will touch on what cybersecurity means going forward, right? With how the internet is essentially going to the next level, right? So some of those risks are, as you can see, not necessarily new, right? These were issues that were introduced to us with the rise of the internet, right? So we have, hate and discrimination, misinformation and disinformation. We have scams. Scams we know fraud is a large issue in Southeast Asia. I know Thailand is actually doing a lot of really good work on that front. And thinking about how can we also use AI to prevent those issues, right? Because as a tool, how do I use it to protect myself as much as the bad parties are using to attack or create, essentially aggravating certain risks, right? So how does AI actually intensify some of these risks, right? It almost goes into a loophole where you think about how the ability to, for example, change voice and images, like we saw this morning, right, with generative AI, recreate things entirely new that didn't necessarily exist before. That gives the capacity to manipulate in the bad hands, you might say, right? It can spread at an unprecedented scale. And that, I think, it's key here, right? The issue of how it spreads, it's no longer how we used to see that happening 10 years ago, right? The ability for things to really take, and I think that is a large issue a lot of the social media companies, for example, are trying to tackle, right? They currently have thousands and thousands of people doing control, right, on the image information that you read. It's very difficult for them to fully make an assessment, right, when harmful content gets really spread very, very quickly, as we have seen. I'm going to touch on a few of the use cases and examples of this, right? And that is a real challenge. What's also interesting there is the people currently doing those jobs, they need a lot of psychological support because they're seeing things, they're trying to filter things so that we don't see. And it's quite impactful, as you might imagine, right? So there's a lot of harmful content that gets created now, most of them not necessarily real, right, with the use of deepfakes and other technologies there. And then we have, I guess, the result of that reach and impact being really amplified. So deepfakes, right? We I guess, had a very good introduction this morning. And then there's, I think, three key areas where we see that taking place in terms of online risks, right? We have, of course, the misinformation and fraud space, right? That can be on the financial front, for example, where we're seeing a lot of fraud happening, particularly in Southeast Asia. That can be on the political space, as we can see deepfakes can be created to fake an image or a video of someone ordering something to their population, right? Or create aggravating, I guess. We have a lot of geopolitical risks right now, a lot of political change, tension, and in some ways that can be used to aggravate that, right? It can also be used as a form of harassment and cyberbullying. And we're seeing very much an increase of that, for example, around children, right? Children at schools, and other forms where, previously when you had usual bullying at schools, for example, that will end there at school, right? Now children go home, most of them are learning through iPads or other technologies, and it's becoming a really large challenge for them because they will go home and that bullying will carry on in some ways, right? And a lot of the times I don't think schools or parents are fully prepared to deal with the new way that has been exacerbated, right? And then we have cases of extremism, right? As you know, we did this work out of New Zealand, for example, and you might remember there was a large case of extremism there, which was aggravated through Facebook at the time, right? And, very difficult for, at the time that is detected, you have very little time to moderate that in some ways, right? So as I showed before, the angle that it gets amplified is very difficult to tackle that. So I'm just going to show a little video now on really deep fakes or what they're all about.
Ever wondered what are deep fakes? How do they work? And what can we do to protect ourselves against deep fakes? My name is Sean Batir, and this is Tech Explained. So, a deepfake is a photo, video, or audio recording that you might think is real, but is actually not because it was manipulated using AI. You may have seen this on TikTok, Instagram, or even YouTube, where the tool was used to replace human faces, manipulate facial expressions, and create entirely new faces and speeches that have never been seen before. I guess you've heard about the viral Tom Cruise TikTok videos, which were actually made by a video creator from Belgium. He made these realistic TikToks by combining traditional CGI and visual effects with deep fakes. And if you haven't seen that, then you might actually remember some of your friends and family putting their faces on celebrities with the Ukrainian app Reface AI. It created some pretty creepy, lifelike outputs that let you, for a hot minute, become Wonder Woman or Taylor Swift. The root of why this technology is so lifelike stems from its use of generative models, which try to learn the underlying data distribution of an image. Today, I'm here to give you the 101 behind how these generative model algorithms work. There are two things that you need to know about deepfakes. As of 2021, while there are many advanced algorithms that are used to create deepfakes, the most basic version uses something called a deep autoencoder. Now, while Reface used something like generative adversarial networks, also known as GANs, for their deepfakes, today I'll be talking to you about autoencoders predominantly because they're a little bit simpler in terms of their design. Now, an autoencoder has two parts that you'll need to know: the encoder and the decoder. Now, the encoder part of the autoencoder is used to discover the latent features of both your face and the face of the person that you want to face swap or make a deep fake with. These latent features are the underlying parts of your face that you can share with most human beings. For example, we all have eyes, a nose, and a mouth in roughly the same place. The encoder figures out what is similar between those two faces. We call the place where we put this information a feature set. And from there, we give the second part of the autoencoder, the decoder, the feature set of your face, which gets connected with, let's pretend, the celebrity decoder. That celebrity decoder is then used to reconstruct the celebrity's face on top of your original face. And voila, that's how deepfakes work. So to wrap it up, we use an autoencoder which has two pieces of the puzzle, the encoder and the decoder. The encoder compresses your face into basic latent features that make you uniquely you. We call these latent features the feature set, and the autoencoder then sends that information to the decoder. The decoder then does the heavy lifting and figures out how to merge and put a celebrity's face on top of your original face. Now, with simpler AI models, it may still be possible to spot the difference between a deep fake and a genuine image. Often, deepfakes might have inconsistent eye blinking or lesser definition in some facial features. And if you're overlaying a female face, then there might also be a mismatch in earrings. However, the newer versions of deepfakes are becoming able to learn these subtle features, including how to copy and imitate the original video's lighting. The truth is, while you might think that deepfakes are relatively benign and they can be successfully deployed for commercial use, deepfakes unfortunately can also be used for exploitation. Not only can people use deepfakes for revenge, but they can also use them for disinformation and ultimately undermining public trust. Thanks so much for watching this video. If you guys found this helpful, then definitely click a like and subscribe to my channel. My name is Sean Batir, and this is Tech Explained, a video series where I explain difficult things around us using simple and understandable language.
There's also, I think, that normally when you see a deep fake, you might see an extra finger on the hand, right? So he talked about ears. But I think the issue is also the technology is getting better and better and harder to detect, right? And there was a video, for example, of the president for Ukraine basically at the time ordering his army to that they have quit the war at the time, and that was a fake video. But at the time, it actually took about a couple of hours for that to be properly detected and taken down, right? And then there was a statement coming from him, really explaining that that wasn't him, right? But you can imagine the damage behind these capabilities, right? I think that was what I was trying to achieve with that video. It goes really beyond what we can really see, and in terms of how it can be used by wrong parties, I think they're becoming more and more creative, right? I think scams and fraud are part of it, right? You have now a lot of incidents as well where you have, for example, you had a bank in Hong Kong where someone was able to create a video of pretending that there was this client on the video call, right? Same voice, same image, and authorizing a transaction, a financial transaction, right? From the UAE. So this was also involving different jurisdictions, right? And that was, a case involving millions and millions. That was immediately authorized because the manager was so used to talking to his client every day, obviously, right? Same voice, same imagery. Very difficult, I think, for a normal person who is not a deep expert in AI to be able to detect that that was not a real conversation, right? And then we can imagine the damage that can be created, whether it's on a political level as well as on the financial sphere, right? There you go. So these are some of the examples that we really see coming out of the region. In the Philippines, for example, there was a deep fake of President Marcos ordering a military attack on China. Not real as well. That was quite similar to what we saw happening from Ukraine as well, right? We also had a case from Indonesia, right, during the elections, I believe, that at the time. And we also have a lot of challenges coming from Singapore as well, which is, has done so much around that space in terms of investment to protect, but you also see a lot of issues there, as well as a lot of on the financial space, right, involving banks and so on. We also have the issue that when some of these cases take place, there's a probability that they affect certain groups more than others. And we looked very briefly this morning on issues around bias, right? Garbage in, garbage out. And in a similar way, if you think about smaller minorities, women, children and youth, and other minorities, for example, people with disabilities or specific racial background, you see that those effects are more aggravated, right? Because in some ways, we have the data that was representative of a certain type of community again, right? And those issues being, I guess, escalated now that we have AI that can amplify how the world is basically being shown to us, right? So when it comes to children, for example, some practical recent cases here. One, I think, more specific to the cyberbullying I was talking about, right? This was a case of a young man that was interacting with a chatbot. I can't actually remember what chatbot that was, but that was quite a large case there. And he soon committed suicide, and the family could trace his conversations, and part of that was linked from the perspective that was encouraged from that interaction with the chatbot, right? We also had the case where someone can, essentially, it's very easy for someone to pose as a certain person using AI, right? Because I can talk to you in the same way that anyone would, so it's very difficult for you to detect that that is not me talking to you, right? An example is I'm from Brazil myself, and this has been an issue where they are using AI more and more to reproduce your voice or to clone your phone number and reach out to your family members asking for money for financial deposit, right? And during my last visit, my mom got a message saying, hey, I'm somewhere. Can you please make a deposit to this account? And the only reason she was able to actually, and it was coming from my number, right? So it's very difficult for her not to know that message was coming from me. The only reason was that there was something in the words that was used that's not normally the way that I would address her, right? And so and then she called me separately, and it was able to detect that that message wasn't coming from me. But I think going back to how that, I think it's more damaging if we think about children or if we think about minorities, is that children particularly are much less likely to discern, right, what is real, what is not real. They also learning as much as AI is in many ways. And now we are having, I think, the largest issues where we have countries that are already introducing AI as part of the curriculum, right? So children are using more on a daily basis, right? But not fully, I think, educated or prepared to really think about what can go wrong here, and there are certain things that are not real, like we were speaking about hallucination. Most of the population would not know that when they're interacting with ChatGPT or another large language model that is not necessarily telling them the truth, right? And you can imagine how dangerous that can be, particularly now that we have children having access to that. There's also the positives, right? I mean, we can imagine the benefits also of bringing access to education in countries where they're more isolated, in remote areas, to children that have not necessarily been able to access education in the same way before, right? You can now go online, for example, and you might be able to do an online course with one of the top universities in the world online and free, right? That is what access is, and I think AI is taking that to a new dimension in some ways. So I guess the question for us is, how do we make sure that AI is used to create that access that we don't have, particularly if we think about the region here, but that we are also correctly preparing people, and particularly children, to use these tools correctly, right? Teachers and so on. So there's also, I think, the issue of if we think about certain jobs and how there's a lot of tension about AI taking my job away. So you can imagine of a tool that is coming, being deployed in a certain environment space, and not necessarily giving people the full training, right? A recent research actually found that for some organizations that are deploying AI, but not necessarily preparing their workforce for that, to use it, adopt, detect when something goes wrong, they actually seeing a decrease in efficiency and an increase when they're doing the proper training and preparation that it's needed, right? So they're actually explaining how do we use this? How is this supporting you with your job and tasks rather than it's just augmenting you, right? So as we also saw this morning, we know of the technical, I guess, the gaps and the technical safeguards. And one of them is there a solution to hallucination, right? If there is no solution to hallucination, what is our solution, right? Is it that we need to be aware of that possibility and we need to perhaps better educate people for that issue so that they're able to properly detect, right? So no single solution, essentially. I wish that I could come here and give you a solution. And I must say, as we were carefully working on that project, it becomes very challenging, I think, to think about. We know AI is here to stay, and it's only improving by the minute as we speak. And what is our solution to some of these key issues and challenges, right? Limitations of filters. So some of the things that I think, a few of the technical experts, governments are experimenting with are things like labeling, right? Or watermark, as it was mentioned, right? What are the possibilities of thinking about if there is, if I see an image or a video that is not real, how can I tell my population, or is that a way to know where that comes from, right? The challenge is we haven't managed to do that well yet. It's currently in research. As much as the watermark improves, the technology improves, and it can also be used by the same people, right? And that is one of the challenges, I would say, with open source, perhaps, right? Because initially, you have seen Meta really talks a lot about that, right? Making something open source so that everyone can access, right? The challenge with that is that when you do that, that is also going to be used by the wrong people, right? Across the globe, on top of a lot of geopolitical challenges that we already experience around countries, right? So we're currently, I guess, on a space thinking about how do we refine and better detect some of these challenges, right? So what our recommendations were out of the work we did on that intersection with online safety was really three core steps, right? So the first one is to prepare. How do we appropriately prepare people, building awareness and providing education around these issues? Because as we know, they might not disappear, right? The hallucinations and some of the things we experience with AI will probably only aggravate as the technology improves. How do we curb? So how do we think about the betterment of moderation techniques, right? There's a lot of great research happening in that space as we speak, and the hope that we'll be able to better tackle these issues as we go forward. And then finally, how do we respond after something went wrong, right? So how do we provide support and the right communication when we see something going wrong? So Thailand actually has a center that was created a few years ago, which provides cybersecurity support. I can't quite remember the name right now, but it's, I think, one of the first centers that we see specifically working on that space. Singapore has recently launched as well, or in the process of expanding that, and looking at AI and that cybersecurity intersection, right? NetSafe, who we actually did the project in collaboration with, they are a channel that receives complaints and notice, I think, when these things are coming, right? They estimate that New Zealand spends annually about 1 billion each year on issues related to fraud and so on as a result of AI specifically, right? And so as we talked about that preparation phase and education and awareness, I think that brings me to talk about this recent work that we did in collaboration with LinkedIn, looking at what is happening in that workforce transformation space. Just checking for time. We're still okay. And so some of the key things that we are seeing there. That research, by the way, is specific to ASEAN. Okay, we haven't gone global, but we know there's a lot to explore, I think, on a global level, right? So 66% of business leaders would not hire candidates lacking AI skills, right? 66%. How many people do you think have AI skills right now? It's interesting, right? And what is happening to them? But we know that that is a growing expectation, right? And I thought this was quite remarkable, right? We are seeing 860% growth in learning. So year over year, there's an increase in AI course enrollments across ASEAN countries. And that is remarkable. I think that really goes to that point about accessibility, right? You can imagine the possibilities here. Where does that put the young generation if they have access to the education level that was before not possible, right? So the number one skill demand, guess what that is? Generative AI. Generative AI skills. So, expectation that there are some awareness or understanding of what ChatGPT Copilot is, right? And it's essentially the fastest growing market in ASEAN right now. So, given we see this, but also that we know 66% of the population don't have the AI skills yet. So what do we need to do? I think the first thing is really thinking about upskilling, right? How do we conduct a mass upskilling? Singapore has started that quite early in the region. They have many great programs. One of them called the Future Skills Future. They have a lot of programs, education coming out of AI Singapore. Which is also actually just building on, there was when we talk about bringing something which is culturally sensitive to the region, AI Singapore launched something that's called Sea Lion, right? So that is its own large language model that had the intention to spread to other countries, right? And think about then how each country could adopt that, but respecting the religious cultural values that you would need, right? The second point is that about 70% of the ASEAN workforce is made out of SMEs. That is the bulk of what you see happening here. And so you clearly see the importance of bringing AI to that space and making sure that they fully empower to use AI, right? And then finally, because we're speaking so much about technology that can cross borders, we are in this room here in Thailand, but we know that something can be happening next door, Indonesia, or on the other side of the globe, connected with what we see here in Bangkok in terms of how it can be used for good or bad, in terms of that fraud example that I shared before, right? So how do we work together to develop more regional standards and countries come together to collaborate on that front, right? So I think there's a lot of growing initiatives coming from ASEAN. In a couple of weeks, you have Malaysia introducing the AI safety network, I think it's what they're calling, right? And bringing together countries to really focus on those issues and how they can integrate in the AI as a potential benefit for the region. I think there's no longer a question about the benefits of AI and the potential that it has for the region. I think the question is how do we address those challenges as we go forward? So how do we then to, I think, conclude on a space of collaboration? How do we think about building an inclusive AI space in the region, right? So I think a combination of three elements here, which is leadership, policy that fosters innovation, right? That's very important because I think we see a lot of developments happening on a regulatory space. Oftentimes, countries might look up to the three big players, which are China, US, and a bit of what we see happening in Europe. Europe had the AI Act, of course. That was the first regulatory on the regulatory space, right? Which has impact globally because for anyone doing businesses with Europe, they do need to take that act into consideration, right? But also, I think for the region, what is really important is how do you adapt what is happening here in the local context to how you really want to use and adopt AI. And that might not necessarily be a copy and paste exercise from the US or China, right? When we worked on that specific project, we really saw very carefully, because we engaged a lot of the government leaders from different countries, the concern of not doing a copy and paste exercise, right? How do you respect the local religion, the local culture? And I think that remains a priority, really, in thinking about how we go forward. One of the key recommendations that we're making is what we're calling an ASEAN AI technical facility. That is not only a place that we go to talk about how much we can do nationally, locally, how much we can do as a region coming together, right? So Southeast Asia is set to become the fourth largest economy in the world, right? You can combine that with the power of AI and imagine what is possible if we get this right now, particularly on that education space, I believe. So that leads us to the capacity building that we need to really see fostering here. So that's it from my side.
So thank you very much, Ms. Kelly, for your insightful presentation on the AI landscape in ASEAN. Thank you very much for
Thank you very much.
Thank
Hope
you.
that was helpful.